start. Okay, so for those of you who don't know me, my name is Rose Fletcher. I'm a specialist speech and language therapist, and I'm also a Cognos autism champion. So I work across the borough supporting families and schools to support children and young people with autism. In addition, I am the team manager for several special schools, including Oaks Park High School that has an autism base, Carew Academy, which is obviously, for those of you who don't know, a special school, and Foresters Primary School. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to start to share a presentation. Please do let me know if you're having any problems seeing it or hearing anything, and I will do my best to adapt that. So today what we're going to talk about is supporting language and social communication through quality first teaching. Sorry, can you all see that okay? So the agenda for today is what is quality first teaching, autism and language difficulties, listening and auditory processing, receptive language, expressive language, social communication, vocabulary development, levels of questioning, support in schools, inclusivity, and additional support strategies. Okay. Tanya, can you just confirm that the slides are changing? Yeah, okay. So what is quality first teaching? Well, I don't want to teach any of you how to suck eggs, but I just thought it would be worth having a look again just to remind ourselves about what quality first teaching actually is. So based on an article that I looked up, I did quite a lot of research into it, and this is the one that I like the best. And they describe it as a style of teaching that puts emphasis on high quality teaching, which is inclusive of all pupils' needs. It is an instructional approach which supports differentiated learning, strategies support SEND pupils, learning in class, and ongoing formative assessment, as well as many other aspects. Quality first teaching ensures that each student must receive teaching according to the student's preferred learning styles. Well, I guess for those of you that work in, specialist settings, or indeed even in mainstream, there is such a vast and ever complex range of students in our classrooms. So that, I think, is a really key thing. For instance, if a student finds it difficult to grasp a concept through visualization, the teacher must use alternative ways such as verbal and auditory teaching to explain the same concept. So finally, the most effective teaching staff personalise their style of teaching to suit their students' needs. Appreciate completely, that's quite often easier said than done, but certainly it's what we're all aiming for. So please do feel free to call out through your microphones, or alternatively use the chat. But I just thought if you could just take a couple of minutes just to share with the group any strategies that you currently use in your schools or classrooms that you feel, are, positive and proactive ways of supporting or embedding communication in the classroom. So if you'd like to chip in, that would be really amazing. I'll give you a minute or two to think about that. Like I said, please do feel free to use the chat. Does anyone have anything they'd like to share? Here we are. Just one. Creating a clear routine if everyone's sure what to do. Absolutely. Reread a question. Allow extra processing time and repeating instructions. Coloured backgrounds on digital presentations and a readable font. Absolutely. Underlining, highlighting keywords. definitely. What else have we got here? We used pupil passports, which are an individualised summary of pupil strengths and summary of strategies from diagnostic reports. Yeah, that's amazing. Follow up verbal instructions with written instructions. Ask, absolutely. Pre-teach keywords and use visual task lists to break down instructions. Yeah, absolutely. So there's a whole host of things there that you're all absolutely doing already, which are all really important and relevant. I've got a few more here. Chunk down workload. Yeah. Ask for support by raising hands or making support cards visible. Use a small whiteboard and write down the keywords. Absolutely. All of those things are really pertinent and really, really relevant to supporting our children and young people in schools. The list, absolutely, Tanya, reducing your language, very, very important. We'll touch on that a bit later. But absolutely, some really key points written down there. And of course, those things are ever changing and always individualized to very individual students in your class, some of which will benefit, most of which will benefit from everything anyway, even the ones without SEN. But there's also obviously a whole host of other strategies that we can also use to support those communication skills in the classroom. So we're going to move on. So for quality first teaching, I wanted to show you this model. Again, it may be something that you're already familiar with, but it shows you really how you as a teacher or teaching staff should be considering integrating quality first teaching. So you'll see at the bottom, universal, which is exclusive quality first teaching for everybody. We'll see a bit later, but in terms of therapy delivery across our Sutton schools, we're using a very similar model, which is another reason why I wanted to show you this model now. We also have targeted interventions. They would be interventions, again, as teaching staff, you would probably personalise a little bit, but also consider as a team that may be useful for your children or young people in the school. And then finally, the specialists, they're the ones that need that little bit of extra, probably very, very highly personalised, very adapted curriculum. I'm guessing most of those would probably have an education, health and care plan as well, but not necessarily. As we know, there are supposedly less emphasis on education, health and care plans at the moment, and more emphasis on the schools kind of adapting the use of these models and kind of doing what they can to support children with SEN in the classroom. So it's just worth keeping that in mind. So just a quick question for all of you before we continue. If you could again use the chat, what percentage of the UK population would you guess is autistic? So if you can just choose one of those options and put them in chat so we can see what you're all thinking. Yeah, a few different answers there. It's actually 1.7%, so I was a little bit cheeky. It was somewhere in between 1 and 2%. But obviously that figure is ever changing because obviously there's an increased awareness of autism across both adults and within the school settings now. So people are increasingly aware of, you know, what autism looked like, the kind of diagnostic processes, and also, you know, the presentations of an autistic child or young person, what that looks like. And that is something that's evolved quite significantly more over the last 5 to 10 years. So we're seeing an ever changing picture there. So what I've said about autism and languages is autistic children and young people may have difficulty developing language skills and understanding what others say to them. This is like receptive language. They may also have difficulty communicating non-verbally, such as through hand gestures, eye contact and facial expressions. And this is what we call expressive language. Language abilities vary between individuals. However, the vast majority have some level of impairment. This may manifest as difficulty with communicating using speech or language, understanding meaning and rhythm of words and sentences, understanding of body language and the meanings of different vocal tones, following another's interests, but a broad range of vocabulary in areas of their own specific interests, and social interaction. So what percentage, another question for you all, what percentage of autistic young people have language difficulties, would you say, so of the autistic population? Again, if you could use the chat, that'd be great. Yeah, it's actually 80% of the autistic population have some level of language and communication difficulties, and 40% of the population, of that autistic population, that have severe, what we call severe expressive receptive language difficulties. And in fact, some young people unfortunately never develop what we would call verbal communication at all. So with the ever increasing numbers in the classroom of autistic young people, but also with the general population of people with language difficulties, we're talking about quite a significant average in the classrooms, which again we'll look into a little bit more as we move forward. So just having a reminder what language difficulties impact on. So there's a whole, again, you know, I'm sure you're very aware of a lot of these things, but just again, as a reminder to all of us, play, social development, emotional, thinking, problem solving, behaviour, learning, and reading and writing. The list is probably endless. There are so many branches from those sort of key points, but it's really just worth remembering what an impact language difficulties can have on that individual. And you know, that one there, the emotional and also the social, really they're the ones that ongoingly seem to impact the mental health of our students and young people, just because if they don't get the right support to kind of be integrated into the classroom and to feel part of a group or feel part of a school, this really has quite a significant impact on their long-term mental health. And this goes on well into adulthood, as we will talk about again in a minute. So language development, I just thought it was worth revisiting this model if you haven't already seen it. So in order to absolutely have the icing on the cake, which we do here with our speech sounds, the key point of almost language development is at the very, very start, that attention and listening. That is the key thing where babies, toddlers, children and young people, and again going on into adulthood, this is where all the language is learned. So this is the foundation for all of the other layers on top. Play and interaction, you know, that's why in the early years curriculum they put so much emphasis on play and interaction, because obviously that's part of the whole building block of getting to understand language, developing your expressive language, and then finally your speech sounds. So it doesn't matter whether you have autism or developmental language disorder or any other learning difficulty, all of these building blocks will apply. So just remember that. So going back to the baseline block here of attention and listening, how long do you think your child can listen and focus for? Who would like to put maybe a couple of things in the chat to say this is how long they think like a child can focus? So James, 10 seconds, maybe for some of our students, absolutely. If age 7 minutes, etc. Okay, I mean, Anna, yeah, well done. I think you hit the nail on the head there with 5 minutes. We say, and if you look at this diagram here, this is a typical pattern of listening. So an average child, obviously this is going to vary hugely on the individual, particularly those that obviously have comorbid conditions such as attention deficit disorder, but actually a typical pattern of listening, as you can see, for the first 5 minutes, 100%, and then it steadily goes down to basically nothing after 30 minutes. So what I wanted you to quickly do is just have a little think. Sorry, I'm making you work hard today, I know. I've put discuss in groups, but again, use the chat by all means. What do you think it is that you can do to break down the amount of time for talking, or what indeed do you already do that reduces the amount of talking in the classroom? So has anyone got any strategies that they use? Question and answer games, whiteboards, definitely. Really good idea. Keeping it as visual as possible, I guess. Chunking, provide a variety of tasks. Break down lessons into chunks, allow students a few minutes for independent practice. After initial explanation, break it up with other types of activities and more interactive. Yeah, all extremely relevant. I've just put a few ideas on the next slide. So it's just, again, thinking about this building block. So giving learning breaks, giving the students opportunities to talk about what they've learned, the use of videos, quizzes, and just considering that time all the time, just giving them time to break it up, like you say, chunking information, giving them time to get up and move around if they need to, allowing them to have a drink of water at the desk if appropriate, and so on. All of those things will really, really help. Okay, so we've got attention and listening, but we also have something called auditory processing, and that's the child or young person's ability to process the information that they've heard. So a lot of you have already mentioned many of these things, but strategies to support auditory processing, so that's the ability again to process and understand the verbal information that they've been given. So it's chunking information, reducing the use of long sentences, omitting unnecessary grammar, e.g. the and. Here I've given some examples, is like, you know, it's just of the keywords. Down would be the keyword, stairs, cupboard, left, second shelf. So those students that have difficulties processing that information, it is really probably important to kind of reduce the amount of language that you're using. Check they are looking and listening. I quite often get students to repeat back what I've just said. You know, encouraging particularly our young people in school, which actually I've noticed in therapy sessions they're often quite reluctant to do, is just to write down keywords. And quite often they'll say to me, oh, you know, we don't have to do that in class. And I'll say, yeah, but you know, if it's helping you to remember those keywords, then it's really, really important. Quite often when they do write them down, it's amazing how much they can recall, and it definitely does support their comprehension. Some students, even the more able ones, sometimes when you really break it down, you'd be surprised at how little they can actually take on. In fact, I was working with some quite able, on the face of it, students only this morning, and when it actually came down to it, they couldn't recall any part of a sentence that was more than 5 words long. So it's just worth keeping that in mind, and maybe even taking the time to actually sit down and really trying to figure out how much they are actually processing of what you're saying, because obviously this is key to learning. Here's just a graph just to show you, just in terms of information that you provide. Again, based on the typical population, within the first 10 minutes, most students will remember most of it, you know, 100 to probably 98%. After a day, you know, this curve reduces quite a bit. and then almost after 6 months it goes flat. So quite often you hear teachers and teaching staff saying, oh, but I've told them this already. But I think the key thing, especially for that really pertinent information, and I can't stress this enough, is all about repetition. It's all about repeating the information 20 times if you need to, on a daily basis. Quite often in schools, particularly actually at the primary school I work in at the moment, for example, we do things like verb of the week, because a lot of our autistic students just really struggle with that kind of retention of verbs. So we can spend 2 weeks even just working on repeating one verb. I know that probably isn't relevant to the secondary school cases, but then when you consider how much new information they're being given on a day-to-day basis, it really does make you think how much of that is actually being retained. And particularly because a lot of our students and young people really struggle then to carry this work over into the home environment, because their day, they find in many instances, as I'm sure you know, extremely exhausting. Okay, so we're going to have a look at receptive language now. So just to reiterate, receptive language is difficulty understanding what people are saying, and difficulty understanding words and connecting these with ideas. So this can often look like tuning out when people talk, trouble following directions, trouble answering questions, interrupting people who are speaking, asking people to repeat what they say, and giving answers that are off, so they're not quite what you've asked them, misunderstanding what's been said and not understanding jokes or idioms. This is again all fairly typical of a child with developmental language disorder, but also very typical of our students with ASD. So if they're showing any of these behaviours, it probably is a clue that they're not understanding at all what you're saying, or haven't had the opportunity to process what you've said. And for some of our more severe learners, it may even be that they're repeating back what you've said, which is something that we call echolalia, which you may or may not be familiar with. And that's when they repeat back verbatim what you've just said, really as a way of trying to process the information, but also as an indication that they really haven't understood how to respond at all. So expressive language, again, looking at the clues, can the pupil provide a response that makes sense? Can they use sufficient vocabulary? Do they have the grammar? Do they have word finding difficulties? Are they able to self-monitor their speech so as to hold an ongoing conversation? Again, if they can't do any of these things, it will probably be a very high indicator that these individuals are not able to express themselves in the way that you would expect an average student at high school to be able to do. So it's really, really worth kind of keeping note of that. Another quick quiz question for you. What percentage of autistic students have learning difficulties? If you wouldn't mind putting it in the chat, what you would guess or no. It's actually 1 in 3, but when you consider, I know it's not diagnosed separately anymore, but when you think of the old Asperger's, where actually, you know, some of their learning skills are quite good, so they might have specific areas of interest that they're actually very good at, although they might have deficits in other areas. But it's actually 1 in 3 individuals, female autism, tend to have less learning difficulties than male, which is another factor in that, but it's actually 1 in 3. So general trends through secondary school, given everything that we've just talked about, understanding and reasoning. So in secondary school, our students are expected to understand longer and more complex instructions, use language to solve more complex problems, understand figurative language, sarcasm and wordplay for jokes. All of that, probably most of our ASD students are going to really struggle with. As we know, the vocabulary increases. Pupils learn approximately 7 to 10 new words every day. They would need to understand double meanings and learning vocabulary as well as subject words. And in terms of sentence structure and narration, gradually sentences get longer, which can mean they need to explain more complex ideas, and stories and accounts need to be more interesting and engaging. Also, the students are expected to develop the ability to reflect on and analyse their language skills, e.g. I'm good at working in groups, but I can go on a bit. All of these things are where our ASD and indeed our DLD students are going to really struggle, but this is what is part of our everyday curriculum, which again kind of really opens up your thoughts of what are we doing to support all these individuals, as hard as it might be. What percentage of an average class has language difficulties? Any ideas on that? Any more? It's typically 20 to 30%, but in some areas, recent research has found, particularly in more deprived areas, up to 75%, which is quite a shocking figure, of our students and young people have some level of language difficulty in the classroom. So that's definitely food for thought. So in terms of social communication, as I'm sure you all know, our students have difficulty with social interactions, social understanding, pragmatics, and language processing. At high school, students are expected to use sophisticated language skills such as persuasion and negotiation to be successful socially, to keep up with rapidly changing adolescent talk, and the ability to switch language styles according to the situation. So all of those things are what our children with language difficulties and autism really struggle with on a day-to-day basis. So in terms of social development, I've just come up with a list here, but I'd be really happy to hear from other people if they have anything else they'd like to add to this list. But I said do provide opportunities to work and play with others. And by play, I appreciate in terms of high school, that word might not be appropriate, but actually it's just about that interaction. So providing opportunities so that they can interact with others, even if they're at a slightly different level to them. But if an adult's there to kind of intervene and supervise and kind of sit as a go-between, that can be really, really helpful. Provide forums to discuss specific areas of social development. You know, some of our young students get really, really confused about what they've done wrong. They can't reflect in the same way as our neurotypical caseload, and they really come, and I see this all the time in schools where our students just come back and I just don't understand what it is I've done wrong. I don't understand why that person doesn't like me. I don't understand why when I did this, that person said they didn't want to be my friend anymore. They just don't get it. So it's having forums, previously known, I suppose, more in terms of social skills groups, to discuss these specific areas of social development. And this needs to be really a safe space where they can ask these questions without feeling judged or undermined. The opportunity to practice specific skills. I mean, again, we do that within speech and language therapy, but not all our children and young people have speech and language therapy. So it is really important that actually if they are struggling with a particular area, they do have the opportunity to practice, and that can be done quite easily in the classroom through role play, through theoretical discussions, and just through general kind of question and answer activities, even like things like watching YouTube videos now about particular situations, social situations, can be really beneficial. In terms of the older students, I always think it's quite nice to give them the opportunity to ask what they would like to work on. So rather than us as teaching staff saying to them, actually, I think you need to work on this, it's about kind of giving them the opportunity to say, well, what's worrying you? What do you think you would benefit from? what area of need do you think where would you like to, you know, improve? All of these things are really, really important to those older students, and quite often they're just not asked. Quite often in therapy sessions, again, you know, when I ask students things like that, they'll quite often say to me, oh, no one's ever actually asked me that before. And quite often they don't even know because they haven't had the opportunity to think about it, but they will go away and, you know, depending again on the individual, but they will quite often come back and, you know, say, actually, I've had a chance to think about, and this is the area I'd like to work on. And then, of course, there's always the use of social stories. We won't spend too long talking about that now, but a lot of people I hear in schools very, very often will say, oh, I've written this child a social story, but it hasn't done any good. If a social story is done in the right way, it should be done with the child, not for them. So it's kind of using those leading questions to support them to come up with the right answers. And if they are part of that story and they've come up with the ideas themselves, it's a much more powerful tool than just you giving them a piece of paper with a few words on it. It's meaningless to them. So just be mindful of that as well. And I've just said, don't judge or expect immediate change, because these things can often take a lot of practice, a lot of repetition, as I've already mentioned. And don't set the student or young person up to fail. You know, giving them tasks that you know they're not going to be able to do is only more damaging to their self-esteem. So it's really important that when we do things with our students, we're setting them up to a level that they can understand. Has anyone else got anything they'd like to add to that picture? Okay, we'll move on. So just being a bit more specific now, I was going to go on to vocabulary. Many of our students struggle to learn new vocabulary. In secondary schools, students on average need to learn 7 to 2 new words a day, which we've just talked about. So just again, a visual diagram. How well do I know the word? I've never heard it before. I've heard the word, but I don't know what it means. That, I would say, is the typical one. I know what this word means, but I can't explain it. I know what the word means and I can explain it. So they're the stages of learning words. There are loads of things that you can use to support that. I like the use of mind maps, which is sort of being shown here. Use the how well do I know the word visual. Gain keyword lists from your teachers, or you can look at the pupils' books and identify keywords if you're working with them individually, or get them to write their own word book. So any words that they hear in the class that they're not sure of the meaning of, it'll be an opportunity that they can to take that book home, or to come and find a member of staff that they can get a bit more of an explanation. Use word maps to develop more hooks for the words, e.g. what sound does it begin with, or what other ways are there for using the words, e.g. slow, slowly, slow, etc. Put the words into sentences within context, and use game to learn and recall new keywords. Word connections, word choice, word bluff, true or false, barrier games, vocabulary mats, lollipop sticks, dominoes, visual key and word lists. These are loads and loads of resources that you can use to support that. But it is incredible actually how many of our students and young people really don't even know some of what you would expect to be basic vocabulary. So it's always worth, especially if you're introducing something new, just keeping that word on the board for a bit longer, maybe putting it with a visual, or just really putting emphasis on it and repeating it. That's the key thing, because I think for so many of our students, just to learn it once is just not enough. So just touching on different levels of questioning. So we use, as a speech and language therapy department, which I know some of you do in schools, something called blank levels of questioning. So some of these questions obviously are harder to answer than others. So level 1 are the really concrete, immediate environment in question. What's this? Where's that? Show me this, etc. Level 2 is about grouping objects and understanding functions. Level 3 requires the student to make basic predictions and begin to use higher order thinking skills. and level 4 involves problem solving, predictions, solutions and explanations. I would say 95% of my secondary age students have some level of difficulty with those level 4 questions. So, you know, speak to your speech therapist, and there's loads of stuff online to support that understanding of those questions. But so many of our students get offered questions or are expected to respond to things that they just haven't got any idea about answering. So just make sure before you give really higher order thinking questions, you have got an idea of whether they're understanding the question or not. Ensure the child has heard and understood the questions. Only ask what they are able to respond to. Encourage them to repeat instructions aloud. Give the pupil regular movement and learning breaks. This is all relevant for questions. Write instructions down for the pupils so they can easily refer back to it. Use task lists. Write a help box on the whiteboard that gives the steps of tasks into smaller, more achievable steps, and encourage the pupil to seek repetitions or specific clarifications. But, you know, with questions, just be really, really careful what you're asking them. Another thing that I haven't included on that is sometimes, especially for some of our needy learners, give them warnings of the questions that they're going to ask or you're going to ask them, so they have time to rehearse, because really what you're aiming for is a positive communication exchange. So the more prepared they are and the more successful they are in answering a question, the more likely they are to, you know, want to contribute to classroom discussions in the future. So as I mentioned, I think quite early on, when we looked at that circle of impact on behaviours that we see with our students and young people, this often manifests in what a lot of us would describe as bad or naughty behaviour. But actually, if they're in an environment in the classroom where it feels like to them they're constantly being set up to fail, it can lead to them lashing out, because they feel that their ability to kind of be part of the class group, to respond, to be part of a peer group is constantly compromised, which obviously leads to anxiety, aggression, acting like a class clown, naughty and uncooperative, withdrawn into his or her own world. And this can be because they've had difficulty in understanding and using abstract language, as we've mentioned. They haven't got a good enough understanding of vocabulary to follow what's happening in the class, and they have difficulty sequencing information, which again, you know, probably will put them off contributing anything into class. We see this so often, is quite upsetting. You know, we have students that come into high school, particularly from primary school, where they've maybe been in a much more small, nurturing environment, and that step to high school is just a step too far, because actually there aren't the same staff to pupil ratios anymore where they can just access that help as and when they need it. There isn't perhaps a familiar safe space or a safe person to go and talk to, and so all of those things that they're trying to navigate, and this either can come out as bad behaviour at school. I'd say probably more than 50% of the time it's parents that will come back and say, I don't know what's happened to my child, you know, but as primary school they were so you know, happy, such a good well-behaved child, and all of a sudden it's all gone to pot. And often it's accumulation of all these things that are going on in the classroom on a day-to-day basis that are just causing the child so much anxiety and so much despair that it's manifesting in behaviour. So now to look at therapies. You remember the triangle that I showed you earlier in terms of quality first teaching? Well, we're working on a very similar model, and this is called the balance system. So very, very similar. We're trying to support schools as much as we possibly can to embed as much language friendly resource into the classroom as possible, so that all of our students have that kind of level of differentiated learning, the opportunity to kind of access all of the aspects of learning, and also the opportunities to get that extra help if they need it. If I'm being completely honest with you, there's some reluctance from therapies to pass on some of our students that maybe are doing quite well. But I think a lot of that this isn't anything to do with just Sutton. I think this is countrywide. You know, as you can imagine, the universal support in the classrooms is very, very variable from school to school. So we might have one school that adapts and adopts everything that a speech therapist or other professionals working with those students and young people ask. Others where they have quite a high staff turnover, for example, or perhaps just teaching staff that aren't used to working with individuals with additional needs. And this can make it very, very difficult for outside services, I suppose, to kind of pass it on back to the school. And obviously there is also the pressure on the schools themselves. So as much as possible, we're trying to work with schools at the moment to deliver as much as we can that will support you as individual schools to embed as many strategies as possible into the classroom to avoid kind of that need for specialist support. And any of you that work with children with EHCPs probably know, particularly when they get to the latter years of high school, they don't want to look different from other people. They don't want to be withdrawn. They don't want to miss out on what everyone else is doing. So, you know, in an ideal world, the more we can do here, the less we need to do here. And this bit here often involves withdrawal from the classroom. So that's those with complex needs that do need specialist approaches. And then the targeted from a speech and language therapy perspective sits somewhere in the middle. So it's kind of those individuals where we think, actually, if we can sit down with a teacher and specifically target an area, give you the resources, give you the strategies to work with these individuals in the classrooms, then you should be able to manage that, you know, on your own, if you like. So to take away all of those skills and sit and work with the child and then revisit it at the end of each term or whatever's agreed with your therapist, possibly every half term, just to discuss how it's going and, you know, if you need any adaptations made to that particular target. But that's where we're working for. But again, what we're looking for and what the borough is now is expecting of us is that increasingly children's communications will be met primarily at this universal level. So how does this look in school in terms of universal support? Well, look, the strategies are all here. Movement breaks and sensory surrogates for those that need regulation programs, therapy informed outcomes, sensory informed classrooms and strategies used to support regulation, information presented in a variety of ways, e.g. using tactile and practical approaches, visual support across the setting to support understanding and communication, simplification of language, allowing students time to process information and formulate responses, structured and predictable routines, embedded emotion and regulation strategies and therapy strategies which are embedded into the curriculum. So that's what it should look like from our perspective. So I thought it would be worth looking at this. This is called the vicious circle of support, and it particularly refers to children and young people in secondary school. And it's why do the children, particularly in secondary school, not get the support they need? So it says sometimes there's restricted service for speech, language and communication needs at secondary, which does not reflect the levels of need. There's limited awareness of the importance of speech, language and communication at secondary, limited understanding of the role of language in the secondary curriculum, a view that language development and early intervention happens in early years, fewer professionals with skill and knowledge to support speech and language at secondary, Lack of evidence to support intervention with older pupils, and there's limited research into this area. Limited resources and assessment tools to support and identify speech, language and communication years in older pupils. Some difficulties only emerge when at secondary school, so a bit like what I mentioned earlier, you know, sometimes because of the level of support and the nurturing environment of primary and the lack of perhaps emphasis on the academia, it can only manifest itself as a learning need in secondary, and it may become a more complex picture of needs at secondary school. Difficulties can be hidden either by the person or by other needs. Illusory recovery at primary, assessments show good progress, but difficulties re-emerge or are not shown by assessments. And few young people are identified with speech, language and communication needs difficulties when they are at secondary. So this is the circle that sometimes we have to consider. So another quick question for you: what percentage of students with speech, language and communication difficulties go on to face mental health challenges in adulthood? I can add that to the chat. Yeah, you're all about right. It's actually 70% of children with speech, language and communication needs that end up having mental health challenges in adulthood. So that is a significant amount. And when you consider the proportion of those individuals in the classroom, that is a real concern. Okay, so going back again to reducing your language, this will make it easier for the child to understand. Always use visuals to support the language. Always use the child's names first so that you know that you are speaking to them. It will give them more time to process the information. Give more time in general. And when dealing with behaviour issues, always use a calm, steady voice. 60 to 80% of 7 to 14-year-olds with serious behaviour problems have a language impairment, true or false? I think you probably all guessed it, but it is true. Yeah, again, quite significant. And this obviously translates in later years. I think it's something like 90% of people in prisons have a really high level of language difficulty. So again, it kind of shows you how vulnerable those individuals can become, how easily led they can become. And, you know, coupled with their learning needs, it can be quite disastrous if they're not given the right support. So again, supporting their learning, organisation using calendars and diaries, creating consistent but flexible routines, visual schedules. Most autistic students are visual learners. Task breakdowns, checklists, bag tag checklists, providing extra processing time. Social scripts and stories may be required to prepare a child for special events or trips, depending on the individual. This is just an example of what a school to home might look like, but it's just making it really, really clear for that child to avoid any miscommunications. You know, the majority of parents do want to support their child or young person in the home, but quite often don't really know how or what they're supposed to be doing or how they're supposed to be doing it, and they can't rely on their child to give them that information. So just to have a simple book like this filled out is really, really useful. Checklists for the home. I think quite often we don't think about home enough, and I'm sure again many of you that work particularly in specialist settings will quite often say that autistic young person can come in, particularly after a weekend or after a holiday, really highly dysregulated, and this is quite often because actually they haven't had a routine throughout, you know, the weekend or throughout the week off. So actually just to sort of give parents ideas like this where they've got a really clear kind of routine of what is expected of them. And there's another example here. All of these sorts of things can be really, really useful and can really avoid quite a lot of dysregulation. And obviously, if the child or young person comes into school dysregulated, then this can obviously impact on their whole day and ultimately their learning. So managing their emotions, consider the time of day and what is expected. Is it alerting or calming for them? Think about what your vibes you're giving off, because if you're calm, it's more likely to make the young person calm. Have visuals up in common areas and having a to-do list where they look, e.g. a desk or a wall. Use transition cues, give fair warning if you're expecting them to do something different or if they're about to transition out of the classroom, because a lot of our young people find that really difficult. Visual clutter, assign a social space and or a chill space where there is ideally nothing on the wall, there's nothing really to distract them, just so they can have a calm space to think and calm down or self-regulate. And try and keep things as much as possible in the same place so that they don't have to panic every time they go and get something, because this again can be really dysregulating. And again, movement breaks. So for our children and young people, building independence and confidence is really important. Give the child a role or responsibility and work to their strengths when you do that. Not every child is difficult, in fact, no child is difficult all of the time. So it's kind of finding something positive that they can work with. Provide clear boundaries and targets and make sure that these are followed by everyone, not just them, because a lot of our young people feel like they're being singled out, but actually, you know, most of the rules that apply to them apply to everyone. So make sure it's clear to everyone. Reward and appraise appropriate behaviours and use really specific language so that you're really, really clear about what it is you want them to do. Make sure this is in a way that can be understood and the message is consistent. Disapprove of the behaviour, not the child, so make it clear it's the behaviour you're unhappy with, but not the individual. And reward and praise the things that they do right and tell them what to do rather than what not to do, so it is more positive. So finally, it is really important that we work together. We are working collaboratively towards a better future for our pupils to ensure they succeed, have confidence and better access to the school curriculum and the community. Our aim is to continually provide an outstanding service to your school and pupils whom we work with, and we cannot do this without you. So it's really, really clear from all the research that the more people that are following the same model of work, the more successful we will be. So this idea that a speech and language therapist can come and put it all right is really not the way forward. It is about the speech therapist providing, you know, those targets, providing the specific areas of need that perhaps aren't obvious to other people. But beyond that, it's really important that everyone that is involved with that child is doing as much as possible to work towards those particular needs. So obviously that is the school and the home environment, which is obviously where the child spends most of their time, not in a half-an-hour therapy session. If you have therapists coming into your school, even if it's only to see individuals, I'm sure all of them will be more than happy to support you with anything you need that will aid embedding strategies into those classrooms. So finally, I wondered if you could just have a little think and think about maybe one or two things that you could put in the chat that you might do differently as a result of what we've talked about today. So if you could just put one or two things, that would be great. Yeah, encourage simplification of language. Anything else? Reducing the language. Yeah, absolutely. Asking students to repeat keywords and check their understanding through asking for verbal explanation. Yeah. Checklist of new words relevant to current content. Yeah, amazing. Encourage whole class strategies. Yeah, I think that's really important. Yeah, because I think as much as, you know, there might be individuals that need more support, I think if the whole class are expected to do the same thing, it makes people feel less singled out. And actually, some of the training I did a couple of years ago, there was a really powerful video that I watched. It was to do, I don't know if any of you have heard of CERTS training, but there was one child in this mainstream classroom with additional needs, and she was sitting on a table with a group of people, and everything was broken down on that group of for that particular table for that individual, and they had to tick it off as they went along. And the whole thing was videoed, and I think for the rest of the class it was counted that the teacher was asked to repeat herself nearly 70 times by different students across the course of that learning session, whereas the people that happened to be sat on the table with the girl with additional needs, they didn't ask at all, and they just got on with it and completed the task. That kind of shows you that actually, you know, we might think we're doing all these things, particularly for those children with individual needs, but nearly all strategies for autism and DLD are valuable to all members of the class. Okay, there is some links here for any of you that are interested. I'm pretty sure that we will share this presentation anyway, but there is quite a lot of resources at the moment. Just to draw your attention towards the Cognos website, there's an ASD link with loads and loads of different ideas, resources, and strategies, as well as outside groups, local clubs, and loads and loads of resource packages. It's absolutely packed with stuff on there, so please do have a look. Similarly, the Autistic Society, there's an NHS link here, therapy resources, and there's a link I've put on here for quality first teaching ideas, which I thought was really good. Okay, so does anyone have any questions? I don't know if you do have any, whether you want to speak up. Yeah, the PowerPoint will be shared. Okay, anything for anyone else? Okay, all right, well, thank you so much for your time today. I hope it's been useful, and I will look forward to coming in your schools in the near future and seeing some of these things put into place in the classrooms. And hopefully, yeah, we can all work together to support our young people as well as we possibly can. Okay, thank you for your time. Okay, I'm going to end the meeting there. All the best.